Welcome to the first medieval work in progress seminar of the, whatever year it is, 2026, 26 year, yeah. Well, I mean, I should probably introduce myself because I'm not around here much. I'm Alex Bovey, I'm professor of medieval art history, and I'm on sabbatical, and I performatively just forgot what year it was in a way that is probably typical of my very housebound state of mind. But I've been invited out of my anchoritic cell tonight to introduce our speaker, Sophie Kelly, because as I'll say a little bit more in a second, I've known Sophie for a long time. But I wanted to begin, first of all, by saying, how many of you are new to the Courtauld and new to the medieval work in progress seminar culture? Yeah, I remember my first one, which was almost exactly 30 years ago. So I'm sort of celebrating a little personal anniversary this autumn. It's a seminar that's been running for, I think, since the late 1970s. In fact, Lindy, you'll probably be able to remind us what year it started. And it was established by Lindy Grant.
No,
and
it wasn't. It was established by, it was Joanna Cannon and Jeff West.
Oh, Joanna Cannon and Jeff West, and then when I was around, it was run by Lindy, who did a much better job than anyone could really at hosting papers. So we're all trying to live up to the high water mark that Lindy set in those days. And so welcome to the Medieval Work in Progress seminar. If you're lucky, it will stay with you for the whole of your life, as it has for many of ours. And the format is that we'll have a speaker, and then there will be a period for questions, and then we will make our way down the hall to have a drink together, and then you have the opportunity to speak with Sophie. And I'd really encourage those of you, especially who are doing your MAs at the Courtauld, to elbow your way up to Sophie and talk to her. Be confident about that. And as you'll see when she gives her paper, she's super friendly. There are two other medieval work in progress seminars this semester. The next one, just to note for your diaries, is on the 19th of November. Latin Agbanya, who's the new curator of Islamic art at the Fitzwilliam Museum, is coming to speak on the topic of story and vision, the wonders of creation. And then Nancy Thibault, who did her MA at the Courtauld, I don't know, about 12 years ago, then went and had a very impressive career in the United States and is now back at Oxford, is going to be speaking about the exhibition that she's just curated at the Cloisters, a part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art that opened last week to great fanfare, which is called something I can't remember, Spectrum of Desire, and she'll be speaking about that with the title Queering the Middle Ages. And she's really super, and it's a great show, and if you're on social media and follow medieval things, you undoubtedly will have been flooded with imagery from it. So that brings me to tonight, and Sophie Kelly. As I say, I've known Sophie for a long time. She was, I think, one of the first undergraduates I taught at the University of Kent. Now, I mean, what was that, 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah.
Not very long ago at all. But when she was a history student, and then she went on to do an interdisciplinary master's at Kent, and was then supervised in her PhD by me, but I left to come here. So the wonderful Emily Gary, then at Kent and now at Oxford, supervised her. So I'm really immensely proud of Sophie and everything that she's accomplished, and I'll tell you what some of those things are now. She has had a number of curatorial roles at the British Museum. This is probably the one that most of us will be most familiar with. She was project curator for the 2021 exhibition of Thomas Becket, Murder and the Making of the Saint, which was, as you'll probably remember, delayed by a year. It was supposed to happen in the Feast of the Translation year in 2020, but it was shunted by COVID. But a really, really wonderful show. And she's also held curatorial posts at the Royal Collection Trust and at Canterbury Cathedral. She's now lecturer in visual studies and cultural heritage in the Department of Art History at the University of Bristol. And I'm delighted to say that she has, I think the ink is now dry on her contract with Boydell to publish a book that will grow out of her thesis called The Art of Trinity in Medieval England, which will be a really wonderful contribution to all of our shelves. She's speaking tonight, though, on a project that she's been working on for quite a while. She is trying to break the internet with the Episcopal Crozier, and is very self-effacing about this, but we can see from how many people are here, there is a good crozier can draw a big crowd. And as you can see on the screen, her title is Episcopal Display and the English Crozier around the time of the Norman Conquest. So over to you, Sophie.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honour to be here, and my thanks to Alex and Jessica and everyone at the Research Forum for inviting me. The ivory crozier head, now in the Hunt Museum in Limerick, Ireland, is one of the most accomplished pieces of ivory carving to survive from pre-Conquest England. Measuring just under 10 by 7 centimetres, and my hand here for scale, its relatively small size renders the quality of its carved images, which cover the entirety of the crook and shaft, all the more impressive. Twisted vines and prowling beasts, including dog-like creatures, 2 eagles, and a little human figure, and I will show you him in a minute, occupy the shaft and outer part of the crozier's rounded head, whilst the central sections of both sides of the crook contain 2 larger narrative scenes. One of these almost certainly depicts the 8th century St John of Beverley curing a young boy of the inability to speak by grabbing him by the chin. And here is a close-up image of this part of the crozier. This reading is supported by an inscription below the scene, now partially destroyed, which contains the name Johannes, and I will come back to this scene later in the paper. The scene on the other side of the crook, which shows a large cross-bearing figure holding a small stick-like object against a seated figure's arm, is more obscure and has not been convincingly identified. The dynamism and lucidity of these scenes suggest they were carved by one of the most innovative ivory carvers of the period. And there are some interesting stylistic comparisons to be made between this crozier and an ivory box probably carved in Winchester around the middle of the 11th century. This ivory carver must also have had good knowledge of manuscript traditions, especially the historiated initials of contemporary psalters and Bibles, whose form and layout echo the narrative scenes on the Hunt Museum crozier. The manner by which the vines on the crozier's shaft knot together and entangle its beasts finds parallels in the borders and initials of English manuscripts from this period, especially those made in Canterbury and Winchester in the decades leading up to and just after the Conquest, as here with the kind of distinctive knot-like interlacing that you find particularly in the borders of manuscripts made in Canterbury. The entrapped figure on the reverse of the crozier's shaft, notably the curious positioning of his legs, which kind of fly out to one side, has particular resonances with the figures in a psalter probably produced in the decade after the Conquest. All of this suggests the crozier was made in the mid-11th century, perhaps in the southwest of England, at a site known for its expertise in ivory carving, like Winchester. The date of the ivory crozier head and its connection to St John of Beverley led John Beckwith to suggest it was commissioned for Ealdred, Archbishop of York from 1060, and a known patron of the cult of John of Beverley. Part of my paper today will evaluate this supposition. We are lucky to have considerable evidence for Ealdred's patronage of other works of art and buildings, both in the southwest and at York. So I certainly want to analyse the Beverley crozier in the context of Ealdred's other commissions, something that hasn't yet been done to any considerable extent, to see whether anything further could be drawn out about the possibility of his patronage. But I also want to consider the significance of this crozier more broadly, whether it belonged to Ealdred or not. Hitherto unnoticed by scholars is the unusualness of this crazier's form. This is one of, if not the, earliest surviving crozier from England to be carved with a circular head, rather than the cross-shaped Tau-croziers favoured in pre-Conquest England. Tau-croziers, named after the Greek letter tau because of their distinctive T-shaped heads, and this is a kind of modern name, survive in good number from the 11th century, especially in English contexts. And I'm showing you on the top of the slide here, as an example, the spectacular Ulster crozier dating to the early 11th century and now in the British Museum. Tau-croziers continued to be used for a while after the conquest, but by the late 12th century drop out of the visual and material record in favour of round-headed designs. These changes, I want to suggest, are not just reflective of shifting aesthetic tastes. My current research project, as Alex mentioned, which focuses on croziers made and used in England from just before the Norman Conquest until the Reformation, argues that these objects held both personal and political significance to their owner and operated in interesting ways in medieval society more broadly. Croziers were granted to bishops, abbots and abbesses across Europe for most of the Middle Ages, and are of course still an important object associated with the Episcopal office today. Their ubiquitous in the visual record, especially in the later Middle Ages, has meant they've often been discussed in somewhat passive terms as symbols of a bishop's authority. However, rather than a passive sign or symbol of the ecclesiastical office, croziers, I argue, carried charged political significance. Contemporary records in chronicles, saints' lives and liturgical texts, a few of which I'll touch on today, show that croziers functioned in numerous and surprising ways. They were thrown down in bitter disputes between bishops and kings, possibly broken during a bishop's excommunication, unveiled and publicly possessed amid arguments about the administration of ecclesiastical sees, and even stolen during contested elections. Moreover, the rich materials from which croziers were crafted, and the complex and often idiosyncratic imagery chosen for them, suggest a personal quality to their manufacture. Most croziers have individualized imagery, and this is especially the case for those made in the 11th and 12th centuries, the croziers I'll be discussing in this paper. The specificity of the images chosen for these objects demonstrates, I would argue, personal intervention in their making, though whether this was at the instigation of the bishop themselves or someone who gifted the crozier to them is somewhat difficult to entangle. In other words, croziers are not simply a generic sign of the episcopal office made in an identical fashion for every bishop, and in some cases for abbots and abbesses, but rather a sumptuous and beautifully made extension of the bishop themselves, an embodiment of their status and an outward display of the rights and responsibilities of their office. Investigating changes to their design and the significance of their materiality and imagery can thus tell us much about the perceptions of the office of the bishop at given moments and the changing nature of episcopal self-fashioning and display more broadly. In the next 50 minutes or so, I want to offer a short account of the use of croziers in England around the time of the Conquest. This is, of course, a period that saw radical transformations to the English episcopacy, especially considering that following the Norman Conquest, most bishops in England were replaced by Normans. What I hope to show, though, is that modes of episcopal display, especially in relation to the objects associated with investiture, were already changing in England before the Conquest. I'm, of course, not the first person by any stretch to argue that shifts previously ascribed to the Conquest are more likely to have been in motion in the decades leading up to the 1060s. But certainly one of the arguments I'll be making today is that it will be an oversimplification to identify the Conquest alone in ushering in changes to the appearance and function of croziers and other associated episcopal milieu. My other aim is to try to bring together both the material evidence for this change, the surviving croziers themselves, with documentary sources about the function and use of croziers in English contexts. To date, this approach hasn't been systematically applied to the topic of episcopal croziers, either for the period under consideration in this paper or for medieval England more broadly. There have been some excellent studies on individual croziers, and I'm thinking here about Marion Campbell's work on some of the croziers in the V&A, or Paul Williamson's work on ivory croziers, or Sandy Heslop's work on the Ulster Tau-cross. Generally, these publications tend to focus on the decorative style or manufacture of these objects. And while this is, of course, an object I'm interested in, and indeed aspects like the place of a crozier's manufacture or the lavishness of its materials can tell us much about its owner, my aim in this project is to think somewhat more holistically about their ownership and use. Some fundamental questions about the significance of croziers in an English context, and to some extent in a European one, remain unanswered. When does the use of croziers become widespread by bishops, abbots and abbesses, and why? Were they commissioned by a bishop when appointed to their office, or were they passed down or gifted? We know that bishops carried their croziers with them when travelling, so how might these objects have conveyed a sense of national or local identity, or even acted as sites of artistic exchange on an international stage? Whilst I can't answer in full these more wide-ranging questions in my paper today, what I hope to do by focusing on the decades leading up to the conquest is provide some preliminary thoughts on this topic, especially as I consider this period to be quite fundamental to how croziers continue to be used in the centuries that followed. It's worth saying at this stage that I'm still very much at the start of my work on this project, so any comments and thoughts on this topic are very gratefully received. Just to briefly outline the scope for my paper today, I'll begin by giving a brief summary of the use of croziers in England before the conquest. I'll then return to the Beverley Crozier, this object I began my talk with, and think about how it can reveal how ideas about episcopal display, particularly from the Holy Roman Empire, might have informed or influenced practice in England. The earliest records of religious officials carrying some sort of staff or cross date from the 4th century, though descriptions of these objects are somewhat ambiguous. They may have been straight, crook-headed, or in the form of a cross, and it's possible that all forms were used. Both the earliest surviving croziers and the earliest liturgical witness to their use date from the 7th and 8th centuries. Isidore of Seville, in his De Ecclesiasticis, mentions consecration with a bacillus or staff. And the wording used here is significant, as the principle that the staff was a symbol of the bishop's judgment and a representation of his role in correcting the vices of the people is something that continues to feature in rites for the conferring of the pastoral staff in the later period, and I'll go on to discuss some of these texts in a minute. As I said, our earliest surviving material witnesses to the use of croziers date from around this period too. Here are two examples, one connected to the Abbey of Montier-Ponval in Switzerland and dating in its oldest parts to the 7th century. And a famous example, the Kells crozier, which is now in the British Museum and in its oldest part dates probably from the 9th century. Whilst I don't have time today to talk in detail about Irish croziers, it's worth acknowledging some fundamental differences in both their manufacture and function, as they differ considerably from the English tradition. And in doing this, I'm drawing particularly on the work of Rachel Moss and Griffin Murray, who have both published extensively on this topic. Irish croziers, and some early continental examples, are mostly figured with a dropped and slightly curved crook. The reason for this shape is perhaps a very obvious one. The Bible repeatedly refers to Christ as a shepherd, and this metaphor is also extended to the apostles in the early church. A clear visual association between croziers and the role of the bishop was thus a pastoral one, with the bishop that held and used croziers like this figured as a Christ-like shepherd of the people. However, one feature of Irish croziers that we don't tend to see in the English tradition, even from early in this period, is their status as relic objects. The early medieval church in Ireland, and in Wales to some extent too, had several saintly bishops whose cults centred around the worship of their handbell and crozier. These relic objects were considered to conduct miracles, grant healing, cause springs to miraculously appear, and other extraordinary events. And instead of being buried with their bishop owner, they were retained in the church or cult site associated with the saint and added to and adapted with different casings and adornments. In England, I'm yet to find extensive evidence that croziers were treated in this way. It may be that relics were interred in some English croziers. Some indeed contain small drill holes at the top of the crozier head, which may have been used to house relics, as I'm showing you here. However, the crozier itself doesn't seem to have operated as a relic object with the ability to conduct miracles. Moreover, it is likely in the 11th century that English bishops begin to be buried with their crozier, in a marked difference from Irish examples. What is also distinct about English croziers from this period is their design and imagery. The fact that early English crozier heads would have sat atop a staff suggests these pastoral meanings were also important to their use. But the oldest croziers to survive from England, which include this wonderful tower head from the V&A that I'm showing you on screen, are distinct from earlier continental and Irish examples in their shape, material, and imagery. Most are carved from walrus ivory, as here, and almost all are carved in this distinctive T or Tau shape. Another early example, probably made around the same time as the V&A Tau cross, is an object now known as the Heribert Tau. This crozier was carved in England, possibly in Winchester, in the early 11th century, but at some point in its life it made its way to Cologne, where it ended up in the treasury associated with St Heribert. The now considerably worn, the walrus ivory head would once have been delicately carved with a scene of Christ in majesty on one side, and on the other, the crucifixion. The handles of the Tau, these kind of two extensions of the T-shaped head, are ingeniously figured as the heads of two beasts with fangs and open snarling mouths, a design feature relatively typical for English Taus of this period. It is possible that the appearance of beasts on these croziers, so commonly the sign of vice and evil, represent the episcopal duty to subjugate vice, bring evil under control and provide good governance to their communities, as described by ecclesiastics like Isidore of Seville. The other imagery common to English croziers of this period is that of vines and flowering, budding plants. In the Old Testament, staffs and rods are particularly connected with Aaron and God's blessing of his leadership of the people of Israel. In the book of Numbers, when the Israelites are in the desert, God chooses his religious leader by requesting the head of each of the tribes of Israel to place their staff in the tabernacle. When Moses returns to the tabernacle the next day, Aaron's staff has miraculously sprung to life and is budding with blossoms, leaves, and almonds. This signals God's anointing of Aaron as his mouthpiece, and he becomes the founder of the Levitical priesthood. Medieval bishops, and to some extent abbots, saw themselves as descendants of this divine priestly line, and Aaron himself is frequently configured as a bishop or religious leader. So here he is, for example, on this enamel plaque in full bishop's garb, with his mitre and vestments and pallium, and, of course, a flowering crozier from which an almond-shaped leaf springs. To return to the Ulster Tau cross I showed you earlier, the handles of this crozier are figured as serpents with griffin-like heads that curl under the body of the Tau and peck at its foliage. These serpents likely allude to the miracle associated with Moses' staff in the book of Exodus, which turned from rod to serpent when thrown on the ground, as a sign of God's power and authority against the Egyptians. The entirety of this ivory object is nevertheless sumptuously decorated with scroll-like leaves and plump blossoming flowers, which weave between images of the crucifixion and the resurrected Christ. This vegetal imagery thus simultaneously references the flowering of the rod of Aaron and alludes to the idea that the owner of this object, like Aaron, had been granted apostolic authority directly from God. Tau-shaped croziers from this period are not unique to England and also appear to have been used in northern French contexts. I'm still doing some work gathering these materials together, but the shape of northern French croziers appears broadly in keeping with English designs, albeit with some carved in a slightly more conical fashion, as is the case with the wonderful Tau-crozier found in the tomb of Abbot Morad in Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris. These nevertheless similarly employ floral and vegetal designs in their decoration, like their English counterparts. Establishing exactly when croziers begin to feature as an important part of liturgical ceremonies in English contexts is difficult on account of the lack of sources predating the 10th century that record their use. It is certainly possible that these objects were used in liturgical contexts from an early date, and their function was simply not written down or recorded. However, some of the earliest pontificals to survive from England do not include prayers for the conferring of the crozier or ring. The pontifical was itself a relatively new type of liturgical text in this period, so its form was still somewhat unstable. But broadly, this book contained the texts, music, and detailed instructions for liturgical observations conducted by a bishop, the dedication of churches and altars, the enthronement and consecration of other bishops, and special blessings. Some of the earliest pontificals to survive from England include the Dunstan pontifical, which I'm showing you on screen, and the pontifical known as Claudius I, which both date to the middle, in their oldest part, to the middle of the 10th century. However, neither of these books contain the prayers for the consecration of a bishop or abbot with a crozier or ring, as would become standard in later versions of this ceremony. The earliest pontificals with a connection to England that do contain prayers for the consecration of a bishop with a crozier include Part B of the Leofric Missal, the Sacramentary of Vitoldus, and the Egbert Pontifical, which all date to the end of the 10th century. The form and wording of the prayers used in these books are very close, which is why I'm just showing you the Leofric prayer on screen, and I won't subject you to going through all the prayers in each of those pontificals. After a series of introductory prayers, these texts indicate that the bishop should be given first a ring, hic dandus est annulus, and then the crozier, hic dandus est baculus. The gifting of each of these objects is then followed by a prayer, which offers some insight into how these consecration items were conceptualized. The crozier is understood as a sign of sacred government and a representation of the idea that the bishop was to correct the crooked, direct the upright in the path of salvation, and correct the unworthy. These ideas, of course, draw on the earlier tradition attested to by Isidore of Seville, where the staff was also conceived as a sign of the bishop's rule and judgment. Interestingly, the Leofric Missal also contains prayers for the blessing of the crozier and the ring. These are contained alongside several other blessings for liturgical objects like censers and holy water, and this suggests staffs and rings were also consecrated or blessed before being conferred upon the bishop. Mentions of croziers or staffs in non-liturgical written sources dating before the Conquest are relatively scarce. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle contains some sporadic references that mainly relate to the admonishing of bishops and the threat of having their staff broken. One notable example relates to the case of Ulf, Bishop of Dorchester from 1049, who was dismissed from his post and made to leave England in 1052. Shortly before this, in 1050, he travelled to a council at Vercelli, where, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Pope threatened to break his staff for failing to properly perform his episcopal duties. Ulf, the Chronicle tells us, nevertheless managed to retain his bishopric by gifting money to the Pope. Whether or not statements about the breaking of croziers should be taken literally is difficult to determine conclusively. Fragments of ivory objects that may once have been tau heads do survive, but as these are nearly always found in archaeological contexts, it is hard to establish why they were broken and whether this was accidental or intentional. Nevertheless, what statements concerning the breaking of a crozier demonstrate, even if they are simply a threat or a turn of phrase, is the close conceptual relationship that existed between these objects and an individual's office. Power to hold a given bishopric was understood to be housed in the crozier itself, to the degree that this object must be broken, or threatened to be broken, if that authority was taken away from an individual. To summarise briefly then, croziers in pre-conquest England held important liturgical and political significance. They were blessed in the same manner as censers and holy water, and by the turn of the 11th century were an important part of the consecration ceremony of a bishop, where they were conceived as a symbol of the bishop's role to correct the crooked and direct the upright. In England, croziers were nearly always configured with a tau or T-shaped head, and some were decorated with floral elements and alluded to Aaron and the divine priesthood. They might have been broken if a bishop was stripped of their see, but even the threat to do this in the written sources suggests these objects held a unique kind of power, and were conceived as embodying some kind of episcopal authority separate from the individual identity of the bishop themselves. It is into this broader context that I now want to reintroduce the object I began my paper with, the walrus ivory crozier associated with Ealdred of York. This crozier is significant for a number of reasons, but as I mentioned, one of the aspects that sets it apart from other pre-conquest croziers is its form and imagery, which depart considerably from the other Tau-croziers surviving from this period, and now having seen a few, I hope this is even clearer. In the next part of my paper, I want to focus more specifically on the imagery and potential ownership of this object, to see if it is possible to tease out why such a different design choice was made, and what this might tell us about changing ideas associated with croziers and episcopal display more broadly in the 11th century. I mentioned at the beginning of the paper that the style of this ivory crozier roots its production in England in the mid-11th century. The crazier's iconography, especially the scene depicting John of Beverley healing a boy from the inability to speak, speaks more specifically to a relationship with northern England. John of Beverley was Archbishop of York in the early 11th century, and his life and miracles are included in Bede's ecclesiastical history. The story of John healing a young boy features as part of a series of miracles that the Archbishop conducts as he's visiting local people around the River Tyne, along with his companion Burton, a local abbot who stands just behind John on this crozier. In Bede's account, John encounters a dumb youth who had never been able to utter a single word. John takes the youth by his chin, makes the sign of the cross on his tongue, and asks him to say the Old English word for yes, hei, which cures the boy of his malady. This action is echoed with remarkable specificity on the cast scene of the ivory crozier, with the central figure reaching intently for the seated boy's chin, his other arm wrapped around his neck. Though Bede's is the earliest written record of this miracle, it is also included as one of the principal miracle stories in the Vita Sancti Johannes, a life of John of Beverley written by the monk Fulcard. Fulcard was from the monastery of Saint Bertin and probably arrived in England in the 1060s. He tells us in the early 1060s. He tells us that the Vita was commissioned by Ealdred, who had proved himself, and I quote from the Vita, a worthy successor of the preceding holy bishops of the See of York, by devoting himself diligently to celebrating their deeds and lives and commemorating them in written records. Fulcard's life of John of Beverley follows Bede's text closely, and also includes this miracle in which John grabs the young boy by the chin. In addition to the Vita, Ealdred also commissioned Fulcard to compose a series of responsories for the feast of John of Beverley, which unfortunately no longer survive, and this is a real shame, as I think they may have helped in identifying the scene on the other side of the crozier head. In Bede's account of the John of Beverley miracle, he goes on to say that John's miracle was like that of the Saints Peter and John, who encounter and then cure a lame man at the temple. And this is a story recounted in the Book of Acts. John Beckworth has suggested that the scene carved on the other side of this crozier depicts this story. Here, a figure at the centre, who in this reading would be identified as Peter, is shown reaching down to a man who grasps his leg, possibly a sign of his disability. However, I think this scene is more convoluted than simply representing Peter healing a man at the temple. I'm particularly struck by what appears to be some kind of stick or branch in the hand of the central figure. This isn't something that's mentioned in the Book of Acts or Bede's account. It is also unclear who this figure is positioned directly behind the seated man. He could be St John, who accompanies St Peter at the temple, but his size and the way he looks up to the central figure from the left suggests he is more associated with the seated man. Both scenes, the John of Beverley scene and the supposed St Peter scene, are accompanied by a pair of inscriptions that run around the edge of the crozier head. However, because of the damage to this section of the crozier, they in some ways bring more confusion than clarity. The inscriptions would have run down each side of the outer volute of the crozier and partially survive on the lower half of the head. So we're looking up here, as it were, from the kind of bottom of the crozier. The side containing the scene of the miracle of John of Beverley is inscribed Et Johannes, which seems to fit well with the image above. And this is something John Beckworth kind of very rightly notes. But the inscription on the other side of the volute is more obscure. Beckworth identifies this as reading O sanavit, so to cure or heal, but this requires reading the inscription as a mirror image, so starting, can you see my, yeah, so starting kind of here and reading O sanavit like this, which I don't think quite works. The inscription, I think, more likely reads Vanas, beginning V and reading A-N-A-S here, which may be the Latin word for empty or untrustworthy, or a contraction of the word vanitas, or this is the beginning of a longer and now fragmented word or phrase. Nevertheless, though the inscriptions don't clarify the unidentified scene on the right-hand side of the crozier head, I do think they help in confirming that on the left is indeed a scene of John of Beverley curing a boy by grabbing him by the chin. As I mentioned at the beginning of the paper, the stylistic dating of this crozier to the mid-11th century and its connection to St John of Beverley led John Beckworth to suggest it was commissioned for Ealdred, Archbishop of York, who Beckworth rightly notes was involved in a cluster of different activities relating to this saint. In addition to commissioning the Vita Sancti Johannes from Fulcard, Ealdred was also heavily involved in the rebuilding work at Beverley Minster. And both of these efforts, the patronage of liturgical texts relating to John of Beverley and construction at the Minster, were aimed at bolstering the cult of John of Beverley that had grown up there. Ealdred's career, which Beckwith didn't explore particularly extensively, also marks him out as a likely candidate for someone with an impressive ivory crozier carved with sophisticated imagery and in a radical new style. Ealdred had an illustrious career and was present at some of the most pivotal events of the 11th century. Although little is known of his early life, he was likely born in the West Country, and by at least 1046 was Bishop of Crediton and Worcester, before later being appointed Bishop of Hereford. During his career, Ealdred travelled extensively. In 1050, he attended an Easter Synod in Rome. In 1054, he spent a year in Cologne as a guest of Henry III and Archbishop Herman II of Cologne, leading a delegation to negotiate the return of Edward Aethling. And in 1058, he travelled to Jerusalem via Hungary on a quasi-pilgrimage political mission, possibly to arrange for Edward the Exile's family to be brought to England. Ealdred initially supported the Godwin family in their efforts to take the throne of England and crowned Harold Godwinson in January 1066. But he was one of the English leaders who submitted to the Normans at Berkhamsted later that year. Ealdred crowned William the Conqueror in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day in 1066, as well as his wife Matilda 2 years later. And I will say at this stage that if this is his crozier, then it's very likely it was present at those coronations, which is a wonderful thought, though entirely conjectural. Ealdred remained important in courtly and ecclesiastical circles until his death in 1069, and is spoken of in positive terms as an astute political figure by both English and Norman chroniclers. And actually, he's one of those few English bishops who manages to hold on to his position following the Norman Conquest, so he must have been incredibly kind of astute and important. Scholarship on Ealdred has emphasised the influence of continental and specifically imperial ideas on his work. In the early 1980s, Janet Nelson put forward the convincing suggestion that Ealdred was involved in the composition of the Third English Ordo, a text used for the coronation of both Harold and William in 1066. She characterises this text as, and I quote, a splicing together of forms from the Second English Ordo with forms from the King's Ordo in the Romano-German Pontifical. The Second English Ordo was composed in England, but the Romano-German Pontifical, and hereafter I'll be using the acronym PRG so I don't have to say that, was an influential version of the Pontifical first compiled in around the year 1000 in Bamberg in Germany. Around the same time, and drawing on Nelson's work, Michael Lappage published an influential article that persuasively argued for Ealdred's involvement in the transmission of the PRG, this influential pontifical, into England. He concludes that a manuscript containing a fragmentary copy of the PRG written by a German scribe was likely brought back from Cologne by Ealdred and his party, and subsequently copied by English scribes, transforming the performance of the liturgy in England, and this manuscript that he's talking about is now in the BL. Building on both Nelson and Lappage's work, Michael Hare suggested it was Ealdred who ushered in innovative royal ceremonies for the English kings, based on those conducted in the Holy Roman Empire, and that his rebuilding work at Gloucester was related to the introduction of elaborate imperial-style crown-wearing ceremonies. Several publications have also pointed to the reforming nature of Ealdred's episcopate, again linking this to ideas he would have encountered in Cologne. Ealdred's imperial taste has thus been well established, but mostly in respect of his involvement in royal affairs or the development of the liturgy in England, especially the PRG. My suggestion is that the influence of German ideas can also be traced in the artistic and architectural works with which Ealdred was involved, especially considering that while Ealdred was in Cologne, he would have seen some of the most cutting-edge and impressive works of art of the period. The Archbishop of Cologne at the time of Ealdred's visit was Herman II, and it was Herman who hosted Ealdred and his party while they were in the city. Just prior to Ealdred's visit, Herman, along with his sister Ida, had been heavily involved in the rebuilding of St Maria's Capitol in Cologne. This impressive Romanesque structure, with its distinctive series of radiating chapels, was modelled on the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and was influential outside Germany, where it informed the structure of buildings like Christ Church, Canterbury. St Maria's Capitol was also richly furnished by Herman and Ida with some of the most impressive works of the 11th century, including a set of carved wooden doors depicting scenes from the life of Christ, and a processional cross decorated on its reverse with two prominent images of both patrons. The church also preserved older works with links to the Episcopal elite, such as the Great Jarrow Cross, the largest sculpted crucifix north of the Alps, which was commissioned for Cologne Cathedral by Jarrow, Archbishop of Cologne, in the 960s. In 1054 then, Cologne possessed grand buildings and works of art that spoke to the power and influence of its archbishops, both past and present. It is entirely conceivable that these physical and performative manifestations of episcopal status had as much impact on Ealdred and his entourage as the imperial bishops and archbishops they met in person during their stay. In addition to individual works of art or architectural projects with which bishops were associated, episcopal clothing, as well as the consecration ceremonies during which items of clothing and other objects were invested, became more elaborate over the course of the 11th century. This is a topic explored extensively by Maureen C. Miller, who concludes in her book on clerical clothing that the ornate style of liturgical garb that came to define the episcopal image in the later Middle Ages emerged in the Holy Roman Empire in the mid-11th century. She argues this ostentatious ecclesiastical wear and its display at liturgical and other ceremonies was, and I quote, a shared language of holiness and power, intensely developed by advocates of reform and used to further several ends: the maintenance of patronage, the improvement of the clergy, the visual articulation of hierarchies, and the advancement of clerical claims to status. Powerful bishops like Ealdred of Trier and Bernward of Hildesheim were instrumental in ushering in new forms of episcopal self-fashioning and display, pioneering, for example, the development of the episcopal portrait or dedication image and the composition of elaborate inscriptions that signalled their patronage of books, liturgical objects, grand bronze doors, and architectural works. It is in this period that imperial bishops' clothing in particular became more specific and more elaborate, hinting at the changing nature of their status. In the 11th century, several pieces of clothing, including sandalia, the episcopal slippers which both Egbert and Bernward are wearing here, as well as gloves and mitres, were either introduced or wrestled for more widespread usage by imperial bishops who legislated for their sole right to wear them. These new vestments and insignia were key in the articulation of episcopal status at a time when episcopal claims to power were rapidly changing. Bishops had long held immense power in the Holy Roman Empire, but the 10th and 11th centuries witnessed several crises that challenged and redefined episcopal roles. The investiture conflict, which culminated in the infamous confrontation between Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV at the Castle of Canossa in January 1077, brought renewed attention to the roots of episcopal power and whether this lay within papal or secular control. Indeed, at least on the surface, the investiture struggle primarily concerned the issue of whether the emperor should be allowed to confer the crozier on the appointed bishop during their consecration ceremony. This had been the practice in Germany since at least the time of Otto I and preceded consecration by the metropolitan bishop. Canossa and the events that followed probably brought an end to this practice, but debates over how bishops were appointed and consecrated and the objects that were used in the bestowing of this authority must surely have brought fresh scrutiny to their importance and appearance. It is my suggestion, following Maureen Miller, that the attention these episodes brought to the consecration of bishops, and specifically the arguments over who should invest them with the crozier, caused the objects used in consecration ceremonies to take on a more charged significance, and possibly drove changes to their manufacture and style. Intriguingly, around the same time we're seeing episcopal garments become more elaborate, the style of croziers used by ecclesiastics in the Holy Roman Empire begins to change. From around the turn of the millennium, imperial bishops begin using croziers with distinctive round or circular heads. One of the earliest and most spectacular of these is the crozier of Erkenbold, abbot of Fulda from 997 to 1011. Erkenbold was recommended to this post by his relative Bernward of Hildesheim, who likely commissioned the crozier from the famed Hildesheim metal workshop and gifted it to Erkenbold on his consecration. The iconography of the crozier is idiosyncratic, again suggesting it was a personal and highly prestigious commission. The knob is decorated with personifications of the four rivers of paradise, whilst the stem and crook contain images relating to the fall, Eve offering the fruit, Adam accepting it, and in the centre of the crook, a curious image possibly representing Christ admonishing Adam for his sins. There are some striking similarities between Erkenbold's staff and the John of Beverley crozier. Both are figured in a pea-like shape with one continuous extension that loops neatly round to the base to form a circular head. This head is filled with a narrative scene, much like the historiated initials of contemporary manuscripts. The shafts of both croziers are figured as a living tree or vine, with budding, twisting branches that entrap writhing figures. Inscriptions are also included alongside the narrative imagery, albeit in the case of the Erkenbold crozier around the collar on its base, and simply naming Erkenbold as abbot. As discussed earlier, the Beverley crozier likely had a more complicated inscription, possibly related to its imagery. The Erkenbold crozier was found in the tomb of a 14th century Bishop of Hildesheim, so it was probably being used throughout the 11th century and possibly in Episcopal as well as abbatial contexts. There is, however, no firm evidence connecting the Beverley and Erkenbold croziers, and other round-headed pastoral staffs from this period may equally have informed the shape of the Beverley crozier. Another early example is the so-called Anno-stab, thought to have been owned by Anno II, Archbishop of Cologne. The head of this ivory crozier is rather simple in appearance and is carved to resemble a serpent engulfing a dove, but the inscription included on its metal collar is scholarly and elaborate, combining an extract from Virgil with passages from the Gospels. Imperial images of bishops from around the turn of the millennium on, like those in the Bamberg PRG or the seals of Heribert, Archbishop of Cologne at the turn of the 11th century, also attest to the emergence of the round-headed crozier in this period. Could these designs, so strikingly different from the English Tau-croziers, have influenced Ealdred's own episcopal tastes? We know that when Ealdred returns to England, he is involved in several architectural and artistic projects that seem to have been influenced by ideas from the continent and specifically Germany. He is named, for example, on the consecration stone made for the construction, or made to commemorate really, the construction of Earl Odder's in Deerhurst, Gloucestershire. Most scholars agree that Odder, though an influential figure who may have been Latinate to some degree, was probably not the driving force behind the form of the inscription. He is not known to have ever left England and was not part of the same scholarly class as Ealdred. Moreover, as both John Higgett and C.R.J. Curry have shown, the complexity of the Latin on this stone, the length of the inscription, and its positioning are all unprecedented? Yeah, is that right? Yeah. in an English context. Yet all find parallels with similar inscriptions from Rome and Germany, suggesting it was designed and composed by someone with knowledge from these regions. After his appointment as Archbishop of York on Christmas Day in 1060, Ealdred becomes heavily involved in the rebuilding of his diocese and furthering efforts begun by his predecessors. He rebuilt the refectories for the communities of both York and Southwell, continuing the work of Elfrich and Sinesige to establish these places as significant ecclesiastical institutions. As I mentioned earlier, he also dedicated considerable time and funds to Beverley Minster. Elfrich had begun the construction of a refectory and dormitory at Beverley, and both buildings were completed under Sinesige, who may have added a cloister. It is Ealdred, however, who is credited not only with additional building work, but the installation of impressive furnishings and decorations. These are recorded in the 12th century Chronicle of the Archbishops of York, which states that Ealdred, and I quote, enlarged the old church with the addition of a new presbytery. Above the entrance to the choir too, he had a pulpitum erected of matchless workmanship of bronze, gold and silver. And on either side he raised vaults supporting the pulpitum, and in the middle a higher vault bearing a cross at its highest point, all crafted in German workmanship and similarly of bronze, gold and silver. To be considered a pera Teutonico by the author of the Chronicle of the Archbishops of York, it is likely this extraordinary bronze object was imported directly from the Holy Roman Empire or made by German artists in England, especially considering that Germany, particularly the town of Hildesheim, was the preeminent locale for metalwork production in the 10th and 11th centuries. In an even more tantalising passage, the Chronicle of York concludes its section on Ealdred by stating that whilst in Cologne with Archbishop Herman, Ealdred heard, saw and committed to memory many things pertaining to the character of ecclesiastical observance and discipline, which he afterwards caused to be observed in the churches of the English. Bearing in mind Ealdred's connections with Germany and the influence this appears to have had in this work he undertook following his visit to Cologne in 1054, what light might this throw on the ivory crozier associated with him? Unlike Odder's chapel at Deerhurst and the bronze pulpitum at Beverley Minster, or indeed Ealdred's role in the transmission of the PRG, this object is rarely ever mentioned in studies on his career or patronage. This may be, of course, due to the lack of provenance linking Ealdred with this crozier, but it is perhaps worth pointing out that there is the same lack of direct evidence for Ealdred's involvement in the creation of the PRG manuscript generally accepted to have been brought back to England after his visit to Cologne. In any case, what I propose is that an understanding of Ealdred's artistic tastes and his experience of the lavish forms of episcopal self-fashioning he witnessed in Cologne might strengthen Beckwith's suggestion that it was as Archbishop of York that Ealdred commissioned this finely made, distinctive crozier. If we are to accept tentatively that the John of Beverley crozier was made for Archbishop Ealdred, then it is one further example of an imperial idea imported to England via Ealdred after his visit to Cologne. If this crozier belonged to another of his contemporaries, which I absolutely accept may very well be the case, its form still tells us much about the translation of imperial ideas about episcopal display into England in this period. Its commissioner, I argue, must have had some knowledge of emerging ecclesiastical trends in the Holy Roman Empire and was keen to incorporate these onto the visual representation of their office. It is clear in this period we start to see significant changes to the way in which ecclesiastical status was demonstrated and performed in German contexts, whether that be liturgically through the production of texts like the PRG, or materially via the objects these individuals wore and commissioned. These changes extend, I suggest, to the form of the crozier, the very sign of the episcopal office, and influence liturgical practice beyond the empire. Much recent scholarship has emphasised the mutual influences and exchanges between England and Germany in this period, notably in respect of material objects and imagery. We know manuscripts in particular move frequently between England and Germany, particularly the powerful regions of Lotharingia and Saxony. And bishops, as some of the most well-travelled and connected individuals of the period, were often the conduits through which books were exchanged. Other small yet iconographically complex and prestigious objects would also have facilitated exchange between bishops and the elite. Andreas Dersdorf, for example, has recently argued that the iconographic similarities between seals and coins produced for kings and bishops in Lotharingia and England around the time of the Conquest demonstrates considerable reciprocal exchange between these two regions. In short, there were thus broader avenues beyond the person of Archbishop Ealdred that would have allowed for ideas relating to episcopal insignia to have influenced practice in England. The Beverley crozier is an intriguing example of imperial influence, as it is an object that blends English and German ideas. In its form and shape, it echoes the croziers of imperial ecclesiasts like Erkenbold and Anno, whose round-headed croziers were at the forefront of innovative episcopal trends. The Beverley crozier is nevertheless stridently English in its style and iconography. John of Beverley was a saint that had long associations with concepts of Englishness, and the crozier was carved in an English workshop from walrus ivory, a medium favoured for pre-Conquest croziers. There is also a suggestion on the crozier itself that its maker was aware of the form and style of English croziers, as he chose to depict Burton, the abbot who accompanied John around the time, clutching a staff surmounted with a tau-shaped handle. In its intermingling of English and imperial styles, the Beverley crozier echoes the other projects with which Ealdred was involved, for these also demonstrate an attempt to combine new ideas from the continent with English traditions. As I mentioned earlier, Janet Nelson has characterised the text of the Third English Ordo as a splicing together of the Second English Ordo, composed in England, and the King's Ordo in the PRG, composed in Germany. The copy of the PRG discussed by Lappage is written in a German hand, but has additions in an English hand of prayers that include blessings for statues of English saints. The inscriptions on the chapel at Deerhurst find parallels in imperial contexts, but the design and structure of the chapel is consistent with pre-Conquest English buildings. Though the pulpitum at Beverley was of German workmanship, it would have sat in a presbytery built by English masons in a pre-Conquest style. These are, of course, not the only examples of pre-Conquest buildings or works of art that combine English and continental styles or trends. Indeed, objects like the Beverley Crozier show English bishops of this period, like their imperial counterparts, to be sharp innovators, keen to project a complex picture of their office and status that drew together established concepts of Englishness with new ideas from the continent. To conclude then, what might we perceive to be the shifts in episcopal display that were taking place over the course of the middle of the 11th century? And what can they tell us more broadly about episcopal identity in this period? Firstly, as I mentioned at the beginning of this paper, it would be tempting to read changes to episcopal display in 11th century England as stemming from the Conquest, especially considering the numbers of Norman bishops appointed to episcopal posts in England following 1066. Certainly, this must have had a huge impact on notions of episcopal power and the ways in which this was performed. However, what I think the material record demonstrates is that ideas about episcopal display from the continent, and specifically the form and style of episcopal insignia from Germany, were influencing English practice before this point. Clearly, croziers were already central to the performance and articulation of episcopal power in England. This is attested to by the great expense afforded to objects like the Ulster Tau, which were crafted by some of the best artists of their time out of rich and sought-after materials. Intriguingly, Tau-croziers do survive from the early 12th century, suggesting an overlap in design styles that we might expect from a period that witnessed so much change. By the end of the century, these are nevertheless completely replaced with croziers with rounded heads, a form we now recognise as typical of episcopal croziers. The Beverley Crozier is an important witness to these stylistic shifts, and the earliest surviving progenitor in a long line of round-headed English croziers. And here I'm showing you two really spectacular ivory croziers carved in England in the 12th century, but this is a form that would endure, of course, in different materials right up until the present day. My other contention is that the changes to episcopal insignia that took place during this period were bound up with the arguments around lay investiture. Again, I think it would be too simplistic to ascribe one moment that led to this change, or one reason ecclesiastics began to favour round-headed designs for their croziers. Rather, I would argue that the disagreements over investiture brought heightened scrutiny to the objects used to conduct the consecration ceremonies of bishops, and as a result, brought renewed attention to their form and style. In the decades after the Beverley Crozier was made, England would go on to have its own struggles over lay investiture, struggles that would undoubtedly have had an impact on the owners of these two 12th century croziers. But that is, as they say, another story for another time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing so many incredible objects with us and weaving them together into such a compelling narrative. I expect lots of people will have questions, so instead of me having a personal dialogue with Sophie about her topic, why don't we field your questions? Yeah, in the front, second row, third row.
Did you find any evidence of a difference between an archbishop's crozier and a bishop's crozier, and in particular the Archbishop of Canterbury's crozier?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's something I've thought about a lot. We just don't have the kind of breadth of material like evidence to. So there are no croziers surviving that are associated with Canterbury that I know from before the 12th century. Again, it's hard to conclusively say that this crozier was made for the Archbishop of York. So I'm afraid there just isn't the evidence to be able to map that onto the difference between archbishops and bishops in this period, or indeed abbots and bishops, which is something I'm really interested in too. That might be the case for the later material record, and I've done a little bit of work on a crozier associated with an archiepiscopal crozier that's in a cross-form shape associated with York in the 13th century. But I am at the early stages of this project, so I haven't got to the later stuff yet, I'm afraid.
Yeah, Lindy and then Rose.
thank you very much. That was absolutely splendid, and I yes, the German influence makes an awful lot of sense. I was just going to ask you to sort of think a bit about the conquest and all these Normans who turn up and replace so many of the Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots.
Yeah.
What do you find in Normandy before the conquest? I mean, the only thing I can think of is from Jumièges. There's a wonderful Tau-cross, and Norman Croziers I can think of are later, I think, and
the round ones.
Yes, yes, and for abbesses, all those.
Yes.
But do you have evidence for what is going on in Normandy and before the conquest?
Yeah, thank you, Lindy. The short answer is I wish I had done not quite yet, no. And the ones I showed you on screen, as well as the Jumièges one, are the only ones that I know from the 11th and early 12th centuries, but I'm very aware I need to do some more research on that geographic region. My sense, though I'm very willing for someone to contradict me, is that in Northern French contexts, I think, and Norman contexts, Tau-croziers are used up until the early 12th century. I mean, around the same time as in the English context. Interestingly, Odo of Bayo, who kind of is up in Durham after the conquest, tries to steal the crozier at Durham. So I think that it would be interesting to think about the exchange of these objects that maybe look different when different people are coming into different positions in England. So yeah, sorry to not have a fleshed out answer for you, but my sense from looking at the material that I've seen so far is that this round-headed design is coming from places like Saxony and Lotharingia, and not from Norman France, and therefore probably not coming over with the conquest.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. That was just wonderful. I just wanted to ask you a bit more about the choice of miracle.
Yeah.
And whether you think, in view of your text, that this is about the bishop's voice and correct speaking, or whether, and I only say this because I went to some seminar about Byzantine approaches to problematizing muteness and difference of speech, or whether you think there's something else going on rather than just a sort of imposition of correct speech.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've thought about speech in this crozier as well. It strikes me this is a very talkative crozier because it's got inscribed words on it, and it's about a miracle that's about not speaking and then speaking. I don't know where to take that, and you're absolutely right. It's such an interesting part of this object. And I think it's just such a shame that inscription is damaged. And I would so appreciate anyone's thoughts. I'm really not a kind of 11th century script kind of person. So if anyone has any thoughts about those inscriptions, I'd be really grateful. But yes, the miracle itself is supposed to be about John of Beverley's kind of divinely appointed, I mean miraculous, but like his divinely appointedness as one of the early bishops of, I think bishops of York, yeah. So that's essentially to say, yes, I fully agree. This is definitely an object that's about kind of talking, and therefore perhaps also about the kind of power and voice of the bishop or archbishop.
Okay,
thank you. Yes.
Thank you again. Fascinating for someone like myself who's not a medieval scholar, and beautifully presented. I'm interested in how the form moves from the Tau to this, because some of the manuscripts you had more of a traditional sort of crook shape. Did that move to that form, to the round form, in order, in your view, in order to encapsulate the scenes, or is there something else in that? I'm going to get this word wrong, but Ouroboros, the idea of the serpent there, an eternity. Is that actually if you like, some sort of coded message in the shape of it?
I absolutely think that the design. Well, I think the designer of this crozier is really interesting as a kind of artist, because they're clearly thinking through a kind of different type of a different type of design. But it's one that absolutely, I agree, is very much designed to fit a narrative image at the centre. and quite an iconographically complex narrative image as well. And again, I don't know, I'd be interested in what other people think, but I definitely think this is an artist working in Wallace Library that knows about manuscripts, because this looks very like a historiated initial in a manuscript. So again, I think it's evidence of that really interesting interplay between different media in this period. So my sense is that this form may also have been chosen because the commissioner of this object or the person carving it wanted to be able to fit this very iconographically rich scene onto the crozier. I think it's a very specific commission, and seems to be one that has been thought through very carefully. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Paul.
Two-sided croziers always beg the question, which is the principal scene, if there is indeed a principal scene. In this case, of course, one wishes that there was more certainty about the identification of the other scene, which you haven't spoken about really at length, obviously.
Because I don't know what it is more.
I'm inclined to accept the connection with beads. You know, the way he uses the scene of St John of Beverley as a sort of typological connection with St Peter,
healing the man at the temple.
Yes, because he does appear to be somebody who is
he's holding his leg.
There's emphasis on that. He's not dancing about in the way that beads does, which would be absolutely, you know, capture it. And of course there is the issue of that thing that he's holding in his right hand as well, which almost looks like some sort of pen or something like that.
Yeah, doesn't it? Yeah.
The only thing I would say in terms of this sort of priority or otherwise of the scene, so that might help to read the narrative, is that much later in the late 13th century and 14th century, when you have Gothic two-sided croziers, the principal scene is always the one that's facing right, i.e. as in the scene of St John of Beverley, which would suggest that was the principal scene, if there is any connection between the Gothic croziers and the earlier Romanesque ones, the Saxon ones. That's just a thought, but I mean, it does appear that that is consistent with that being the principal scene, John of Beverley.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think this scene is slightly more striking in the way it's kind of laid out, and I mean, it doesn't mean the other scene isn't kind of crafted in a really kind of interesting and idiosyncratic way, but I think this one, I would agree with you. If we had to choose a side, that's the principal side, then it would be this one. I don't have any sources that tell us about that kind of principal side, or whether that was around, whether that is something that predates the 13th century. But yes, thank you. I would agree that this is a really prominent scene on the crozier. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? The connection that you draw with manuscripts is extremely compelling, and it makes me think about the kind of creative process for making one of these, which I think would inevitably have involved a lot of drawings, at least two, but maybe more, to catch some of the other dimensions. I mean, I'm guessing that you could then transfer onto the blank ivory. And I'm thinking, it's a sort of unanswerable question, perhaps, but are you imagining that at their consecration they would have had their final their final crozier finished? And what kind of duration are you imagining? Because it strikes me that it might take quite a while just to design something like this, especially if it's the highly personalized object, where you'd actually, I think, you couldn't do a Zoom call. You'd have to sit down and kind of work out what the scenes would be, and then presumably do some kind of presentation drawing before carving. So do you have enough time between appointment and ceremony?
What if you get your crozier just before you die? It's something I've also thought about. These objects must take a long time to produce, and I think I have no evidence at all for making this statement, but I've got a funny feeling you might have had multiple ones over the course of your career. Perhaps a simpler one and then one that gets worked up, a really specific commission that you've spent a lot of time thinking about and invested a lot of money in.
Or maybe the staff is what stays the same.
Indeed,
And you
yeah.
can swap out a simpler.
And the corroding on the bottom of the walls library of the Beverley Crozier shows that this would have had a kind of which would have been very typical, a metal probably kind of, oh gosh, what's the word? Connector is not the right that would have connected the ivory head to the wooden staff. And again, I think these are the heads are designed to be taken off and put on. This is for portability as well, because bishops carry their croziers. So when you have sorry, words are leaving my head today. When an injuncture is placed on a country, the injuncture is not the right word. When and bishops aren't allowed to leave with anything, any of their personal possessions, the only thing they're allowed to carry with them is their crozier. So we know from that the croziers went with the bishop, and the reason then they are so you can take them down into individual pieces is for portability as well. But yes, I think that also it's a really kind of important thing to be thinking about is the time span something like this would take to create, and the kind of thought that goes into it and the design. Yeah.
Are there any other final questions? Yeah, Lindy, and then we'll, yeah.
Sorry, this is from complete ignorance, but it's picking up on Paul talking about this being a sort of real double-sided image.
Yeah.
Because so many croziers seem to me to be something where, yes, you can look at it from both sides, but in fact it's a single image within the curvature. So how unusual is it to have double images like this? And I'm just the complexity of trying to create it is extraordinary.
It is a really extraordinary piece of carving, yeah, and working with actually a relatively small amount of porous library as well. So the Tau heads that I showed you, like the Ulster Tau and the Heribert Tau, are carved on both sides. So with a slightly more standardised kind of pairing, Christ and Majesty and the Crucifixion, which you see in lots of different, in stone kind of carving as well. So this, I think, is super unusual for pairing two totally wildly kind of different images from Christ and Majesty and the Crucifixion on both sides of the crozier. And I had something else that I was going to say in response to your question, but it's gone out of my head. Yeah, sorry, but essentially, no, this is the idea of having two images carved on either side of a crozier head is not unique to this round-headed design, and it happens on Tau-croziers, but it's something that I think is being elaborated on here as a design choice. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think we definitely need to get a cheese straw and a glass of wine. But before we thank her one more time, I just wanted to say what a brilliant introduction, not just to the seminars this year, but also just to the concept of the Medieval Work in Progress seminar, which is really all about people sharing research that they haven't yet published and having the kind of dialogue that we've seen tonight. So thank you very much, and let's do a long clap and then make sure that we get some wine.